Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a pleasure to rise today to speak on the sub-amendment to the amendment to Motion 7. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because I do intend to speak potentially on the amendment itself and then later on the motion. But as we've heard the Government House Leader talk about just about everything except the phases of the moon, I hope that the Speaker will permit me some latitude in establishing a general case to speak about this particular sub-amendment. The first point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that in fact procedure does matter. And we do a lot of things in this legislature, but most of it at the end of the day is procedural. And I'll discuss that a little bit further. But I think that's a key point going forward, is that what we're talking about, although on the surface seems to be just procedure, the fact of the matter is, in a place where procedure is the business, therefore the procedure is important. And as we can tell by the books on the clerk's desk, this is the matter of procedure in parliaments and in legislatures is not a new topic. It's something that's been around since the very beginning of the legislative system, the Westminster system. And the fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is that in many things we do, all of us have to live by rules. And generally the principle is that those rules are agreed upon beforehand and that all parties are consulted. And I don't mean political parties, I mean everyone involved in whatever it is that you're discussing agrees on the rules before you start, and then you go forward and proceed with those rules, and those rules are applied to everyone equally. And here in the legislature, in the Westminster system, a lot of those rules are based on substantial historical precedents. And one thing that concerns me about this government, Mr. Speaker, the Gallant government, is that it seems to be an arbitrary approach. What I've seen from the very beginning is a lot of power centralized in the Premier, a force of personality there that is determining what's going to happen, laying down the law and making it happen. And I'll tell you, frankly, in some ways I admire that spirit. But when it comes to procedure and the functions that happen in this legislature, it's not a personal matter. It's not the personal purview of the Premier to determine what happens in this legislature. In fact, it's not even the purview of these members, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it's the people's purview. And I'm concerned at the pace of change. Now, as we know, we live in a technological age, and technology permits a lot of what we do. It empowers it. It makes it easier. It makes it more farther-reaching, Mr. Speaker. But I'm concerned that in the legislative organizations, in these institutions of government, that we need to guard against rapid change. Because, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker, rapid change can bring about undesired consequences and can lead us down a road that we're not familiar with. What's good about tradition and procedure in institutions like this is that it guards the stability of the institutions and makes them stronger. It makes them less susceptible to corruption, and as I've said, makes them less susceptible to personal influence. And these are things that we, as elected parliamentarians, as elected legislators, need to guard against. So, Mr. Speaker, one of my concerns about what we've seen in the last little while, in particular, in fact, what's unfolded today, is that we see rules being made on the fly. Now, I'm happy to be part of the legislative committee that saw these rules come forward in the first instance, Mr. Speaker, and we've heard a lot today about different members' recollections of those committee meetings. And it's unfortunate they were held in camera, they were held in secret, so we don't know, we don't have a record of what happened in those meetings. We only have the recollections, and however faulty they may be, of members in this House. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, what I've seen generally is the introduction of a complete set of rules with a predetermined outcome, with the weight of a majority behind it to ensure that it gets passed. But since then, Mr. Speaker, I've seen nothing but reaction. And as we've seen today, we see what I consider is rulemaking on the fly, what I would describe as too cute by half. What we've seen is today the introduction of an amendment that wasn't previously shared with the opposition. Then we've seen our reaction to that, which was an amendment to that amendment. And what we end up with, Mr. Speaker, is what I would say is a Band-Aid process of amendments, a Frankenstein kind of legislation here that is not fully considered. Now, as we all know, Mr. Speaker, we're part of the Westminster system. And that system, as my colleague from Macdonald shared with us, that system is one of long tradition and a lot of heritage, and it has three distinct branches. It has, of course, the judiciary, we all know, which enforces the law. We have the executive branch, which runs government, and which is formed of members of the legislative branch. And of course, we have the legislative branch. We're all now here in that part of government today. And the important duties and functions of the legislative branch are, of course, number one, to track where the money goes. That's the most important function, to ensure there's full accountability of how the executive branch spends our money. But also, as legislators, we make the laws. And we provide a very important oversight function. And how we all arrive here, Mr. Speaker, we're familiar with that. There's elections. So we have a representative democracy. And inside that system, there are some idiosyncrasies. So we have a first-past-the-post system, Mr. Speaker. And that means whoever has the most votes wins. But let's never convince ourselves that we represent or speak for all of our constituents. That's not the reality. In fact, in most ridings in this province, less than a majority elected each one of us. And that's the reality of our system, and we acknowledge that. But it's important that we remember that in everything we do here, that we don't represent the will of every single one of our constituents. That's why we have a system that has an opposition. That's why we have a system that has a third party. And that's why we have other outside influences into the process. And there are some unique situations that we've seen in this province. We've seen a past Liberal government that had every seat. Certainly they didn't represent, or they weren't elected by every single member of every single citizen in New Brunswick, but yet they held every seat. And in fact, the previous Graham government was able to govern without a majority of the people. In fact, when you look at the percentage of vote, the Graham government was elected on less than a majority. In fact, the PC party in that era had more than 50% of the vote, a larger percentage than Mr. Graham had. However, he was able to form government. So let's not forget that embedded within our system are these idiosyncrasies. It's not a perfect system. The point that I want to come to, Mr. Speaker, is that this is an evolutionary system, and that where we have evolved to now is that this legislature is largely procedural. And I would love to believe that every one of my constituents right now is riveted to their television set watching me speak, and that I'm engaging them every second because they are so concerned about policy and procedure in this legislature. But I know that not to be the case. And in fact, all of the words that have been said here this afternoon largely will go unheard, and they will go into the Hansard, and they'll sit on some dusty bookshelf, locked in a vault somewhere. That's where it all ends up. The reality is that what we say here only reaches our people through the microphone of the media. If this is picked up as a media story, then somebody somewhere may hear about it. But the reality is, most of what we do, most of the debate here in this legislature, is not that substantive. It's not going to change the outcome of things. I hope that we can influence the outcome of some things, but the reality is, much of the debate is staged. We have a government, we have an opposition, and we have roles to perform, and we do that. But the reality is most people don't even know what happens in here. And that's something I choose to remind myself of just about every day, because it helps me keep things in perspective. But the important point is that public debate doesn't take place here in this legislature. The things that move our public policy forward no longer take place in this legislature. 100 years ago, perhaps they did. Perhaps at that time, the nature of debate in here was different. But I know now, from my experience, and from experience of others, that the debate that happens here doesn't generally change public policy. What it does is it puts on record the positions of members of the opposition and members of the government with relation to debate. But it doesn't actually change the debate. In fact, I cannot recall the last time a bill was substantively altered. Certainly in the last 4 years, there were very few cases of that. So the majority of bills that come through here that become law enter this House and leave this House largely unchanged. And I'll tell you that was what happened in the Alward government, and frankly I'm sure that's what's going to happen in the next government, and it's not a feature of a political party, it's a feature of our system. The reality is it's the civil service that drafts those bills on the direction of the government, and that legislation comes here and leaves here basically unchanged. And so why am I discussing all this? Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, because it comes back to my initial point, is that what is important in this legislature is the process. The debate itself is not substantive. It does not move public policy forward. But it's the process that becomes important. And that's why these changes are so important that we're dealing with now, because you're altering that process in what I consider to be an arbitrary, self-serving manner. There's other parts of the public debate that happen. As I've already mentioned, the media, they have a heavy hand in how the public perceives what happens in here. Of course, there's the public itself. Debate on issues is not limited to this House. Everybody has debate all the time, and they then contribute to that debate in a personal way. And also there's the academics. And the academics also have input and determine how public policy moves forward, largely, again, amplified by the media. So, Mr. Speaker, that's my version of how public policy gets shaped in Canada and indeed in New Brunswick. But one of the other trends that very much concerns me is the way power has become centralized. And we've all seen it. The reality is that technology, as I mentioned before, empowers a lot of what we do. And it enables those in power to centralize their power. Email, direction, cell phone calls means that the Premier's office can get a message to just about anybody, anytime, and tell them to keep on track. And as well, the nature of the media means that debate is really restricted, that members of a party and members of the government and individual cabinet ministers need to be in line. They need to all say the same thing, otherwise the media will immediately spring upon any minor differences, and I know that ministers and current serving ministers have had that experience, and members on this side of the House have had the experience where they see that if they're slightly out of line, even by their use of a word or a phrase, that immediately the media seizes on them. And that has necessitated centralized messaging, and the result of that has put a lot of power in the central organizations of government, and in particular in the office of the Premier. And that's no slight against our current Premier, that's just the reality of the system. And it's my concern, Mr. Speaker, that in all of this, that the MLA, at the end of the day, has their power taken away from them. And it's not about the MLA, because I said that, but it's not about the MLA's power, it's about the MLA as a representative of their constituents. And Mr. Speaker, as I see the power centralized in the Premier's office, right down to the rules that govern this legislature, that govern the procedure, the only piece that we have to hold on to, I see a massive erosion in the ability of individual MLAs to represent their constituents, which is the entire reason for this House to exist. It's our total reason for being here, is to represent our constituents. And as we have power centralized, and as the rules of our debate are centralized, it takes away from the ability of the individual MLA to represent their constituents. Now, I hear members of the opposition, or sorry, members of the government talking about other leaders. And I'll tell you, as I've said, generally speaking, this is a trend that's not, as I've said, not restricted to this government or this Premier or anybody else. The reality is that it is a factor in Canadian politics, in international politics, that power is increasingly centralized in central authorities. And it is our duty as legislators, as individuals, to constantly push back on that for the good of our constituents. We are elected to this House to represent our individual constituents. Those are people that are not engaged in this debate. As I've said, they're not actually home watching this right now on their television. They're not. They're busy. They have busy lives. They're taking their kids to soccer. They're trying to earn $1. They're getting their car fixed. That's what real people are doing right now. They're earning their money to pay for all these things in an expensive world. That's what they're doing. And they've entrusted us as their representatives to guard their liberty, to guard their freedom. And I would say it's incumbent on every single member in this legislature, every single day, to guard those rights and freedoms. Not because it's our rights. These rights don't belong to Brian Macdonald, and they don't belong to Brian Gallant. They belong to the citizens of this province. So I want to focus this on the amendment and the sub-amendment at hand, Mr. Speaker, because that's all a general case that I'm trying to make. For the bottom line that I see is that process matters, the procedure matters, because it is the substance that we have to work with in this legislature. Now, I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, as my colleague from Ormoc to Lincoln so clearly put it earlier, the committee phase is a very important phase of government. As we know, we have first reading, second reading, committee phase, third reading, and then royal assent. There's only a finite number of steps that a bill goes through before it becomes a law. And in my experience, the ability of a backbench MLA to influence a bill really comes at the committee phase. That's the phase where you can have some input. At second reading, it's the principle of the bill. First reading, it's the introduction. Second reading is the principle. You can't change it then. You can change a bill when it comes to the floor on the committee phase. And my biggest concern is that the direction that this government wants to take the process here is to circumvent that. And I believe that their intentions are good. I believe that what they want to do is develop a committee system, as we've seen in other jurisdictions, where you have committees of expertise that look at bills and are able to shape them better. And I think that's a great model. In fact, it's a model that's employed in other jurisdictions in Canada. But my concern here, Mr. Speaker, is that if that committee phase is allowed to circumvent the tradition of this legislature, that every bill come to the floor of Committee of the Whole for consideration, and that all estimates come to the Committee of Supply, if we circumvent that process with a new process, the reality is that is taking away the rights of the people to be represented by their MLA. And the situation that this government seeks to advance is that the people on a committee, which are chosen ultimately by the Premier, are the only people that vote on that committee. And the amendment that was introduced allows some latitude for members outside of that committee to introduce amendments. But the reality is, if we skip to this focused committee phase, we eliminate the ability of all MLAs to influence that bill. And in fact, the necessity for it to come here as a stop on the way to becoming a law. And that is a crucial part of our system. Like I say, Mr. Speaker, in other jurisdictions, there's no doubt that system that this government wants to introduce, it does work. But as I described earlier, I don't want to see a Frankenstein system here in this legislature. We have a tradition. We have a system that has worked for us for a long time. And if we're going to change that system, we need to consider all of the impacts, intended and unintended, all the secondary consequences of an action. And if we're going to change this essential piece, and this is an essential piece, of how a bill becomes a law in New Brunswick, that it goes not to Committee of the Whole, but goes to individual committees where only certain members can participate, Mr. Speaker, that's a major change to me. And this is the sort of thing that needs to be considered in a broad, public, transparent forum. And I've heard a lot of chat from members across the aisle about how open and transparent they are. And I've heard it read out of their platform, they want to be more open and transparent. But, Mr. Speaker, I need to see the action. And the action here is what I called for in our committee meeting. I asked that that meeting be made public. I moved a motion to make that committee meeting public so that all New Brunswickers could participate if they chose to, so that we could listen to our own New Brunswick academics, so that we could call upon our own New Brunswick experts in parliamentary and legislative procedure. And we have them, Mr. Speaker. But what I saw, despite the ramblings of the government on this issue, the reality was a sham. They came to the table, and in a secret meeting, they brought forward a fait accompli. They already determined what the changes were going to be, and they were asking us to ratify them. And I'm happy to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I left that meeting very angry. And before I left that meeting, I had the pleasure to explain to them exactly why I was so frustrated by the process. And that was, it was a sham. The determination was already made. And I actually find it a little insulting that of 31 recommendations, there's only one that's come up for amendment. And I would have been happy to sit in that meeting, in a public meeting, where we could call upon experts to give their testimony, to give us their insight. I would have been happy to sit there and go through line by line for as long as it took to explain to the government where I thought we could make some improvements, because I do agree that this is an organic constitution. This is an organic process. Our democracy is always evolving. It needs to evolve. But, Mr. Speaker, that opportunity was not there. The reality was the determination had already been made. The decision had been made, and they were going to use the full force of their majority to make that the reality. So, Mr. Speaker, there's no sense in sitting there and telling them what I think if it's not going to affect change. And moreover, it's not really about what I think at all. It's about what the people of this province think. Mr. Speaker, if we want to improve and modernize this legislature, what we need to do is have an open, broad-based, fully transparent, academic and public consultation on how this legislature should work. There are lots of things that we should fix. Lunchtime may be one of them. I don't know. There's lots of opportunities to fix things. But, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you that there's some substantive change that needs to happen. And that shouldn't come from the pen of the Premier's office, where power has been centralized, but it should come from the people. And we should allow people to have real substantive input. Because otherwise what you end up with is this Frankenstein constitution. We should have an evolving constitution, a constitution that comes from the people, not something that has bits and pieces bolted on, taken from other jurisdictions without full consideration of the impact on the whole. The strength of this legislature is that it has existed for a number of years, and it's existed as part of the Westminster tradition, which is hundreds of years old. And the strength of that means that changes should not be arbitrary. They should not be applied instantly, and they should not be applied based only on the decisions of the Premier's office. They should be decisions that are made in the broad public forum, especially now in a technological age where there is no longer a need to hold these meetings in secret. We can have these public meetings easily facilitated, and there's all kinds of ways to do that. But, Mr. Speaker, the choice was made here to have these meetings held in secret without consultation from the very people that will be directly affected. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is another force that's at work, and that is, of course, the force of the civil service. And we all know that they have a heavy hand in what happens in government. And once again, I think it's important to safeguard the rights of the MLA. And as I've seen, in my experience in the all-word government, there was certainly one bill that springs to mind that I saw move forward that needed a little bit of twisting. It needed a little bit of input. And that was, you may recall, Mr. Speaker, the bill that concerned the handheld devices in vehicles. And ultimately, in the course of 3 years, we were able to get that bill turned around. And we were able, once again, to permit our safe and responsible citizens who use amateur radio that serve us in times of need and emergency. We were able to get that amendment introduced. 3 years later, we worked. And there's no denying that the force of the civil service in our system is significant, and it is something that we need to push back on as MLAs. And our opportunity to do that, Mr. Speaker, is always in the committee phase. That's our opportunity to influence these things. The civil service comes here, they draft the bill, and they're the ones that sit with their minister to defend it. But if MLAs do not have the opportunity, each MLA and every MLA have the opportunity to influence those bills, Mr. Speaker, we're losing a major chunk of our democracy. And I question why it is that these meetings need to be held in secret. And in fact, I moved a motion that it be public. There's no reason. Now, the reason that committee meetings are often held in secret is that they're of a security nature, perhaps, or they're of a personal nature. They might refer to individuals, and an example of that is the LAC committee, because we deal there with personnel issues and security issues here at the legislature. It makes a lot of sense that that committee meeting is not open to the public because those are sensitive matters. But when it comes to procedure, when it comes to a document that is public, the procedures of this House, it's on everyone's desk, it's an obvious document, there is no substantive reason why those meetings should be kept secret. And I know there's confusion about the word in camera. That doesn't mean in front of the cameras, that means inside a room. That means secret. So when we talk about having these meetings in camera, in fact, it's having them in secret. And Mr. Speaker, I have yet to hear a reason why we couldn't have had those committee meetings in public, or at least allowed the opportunity for public to come and hear what we have to say, have our comments put on the record, and listen to witnesses, listen to experts. And that's an important part of this process as well. We've not had the opportunity, except for here today, to debate the merits of this procedure. And what we are debating now is the whole thing as a lump. And that's why we've had to have this amendment introduced. It's because there's a little piece that needs to be tweaked. And that's why we have a sub-amendment, because there's another piece that needs to be tweaked. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that this whole thing needs to be tweaked. The whole thing is fundamentally flawed because it hasn't been considered in its totality. It's a series of changes that benefit the government, that benefit the Premier, that have not been considered on their full effect, on their full merit. It's not been considered as a holistic approach that looks at the whole impact on government. It's a list of amendments that are going to make life easier for the government and are not taking into account what the people of this province need to have their views represented on the floor of this legislature. So, Mr. Speaker, if we want to open, right now we're dealing with the amendment. And I'll tell you, I think it's very sensible, the sub-amendment that we've introduced, that eliminates the possibility of ministers having a vote. Because as we know, when you add another person to the committee process, it tilts it further in favour of the government. But it does strike me as odd, still, that we could have members, in empower members to move an amendment and yet not have them have a vote. The only reason that this amendment is necessary is because you've taken away the right that they already had in Committee of the Whole to make those amendments and have those votes. In Committee of the Whole, every member can move an amendment. In Committee of the Whole, every member has a vote. That's why in New Brunswick the bills come to Committee of the Whole. If you're taking those and shoving them off into some other committee, you're eliminating that right that we have. And that's why we've had to go to this amendment that only gives members half the rights they used to have. It now gives them the right to make an amendment, which they always had, but doesn't give them the right to vote on that very amendment. To me, it seems completely ridiculous that members would be permitted to move an amendment and then not be able to vote on it. And moreover, what the government wanted to do is add another member to the committee. So that the minister now gets to vote and the member doesn't. That seems completely ridiculous. And once again, Mr. Speaker, it speaks to this centralization of power that is continuing to empower ministers and the executive branch over the rights of individual MLAs. And absolutely, and the people. It's giving more power to the executive branch and taking it away from the legislative branch. Now, it's an end run around doing that. I wish if they wanted to do that, they would just be honest about it and say they want to centralize more power in the Premier's office. That is an argument I can understand. But this argument is an obfuscation of the reality. And on this amendment, Mr. Speaker, I have to go back to this amendment, but it is clear to me that after 32 amendments, the only amendment that's moved by virtue of the member from Fredericton South is this one little tiny piece. But the problem this seeks to address is a larger puzzle piece. And that's the fact that we're taking the stage of committee, which is traditionally Committee of the Whole, where all members have the right to vote, we're taking that and shoving it off into a corner on a smaller committee. And like I say, Mr. Speaker, that may make some sense, to develop expertise in committees that allows them to be subject matter experts in their piece, be it finance or social policy. That makes some sense. But the fundamental principle that every bill should come back here so that every member can exercise the rights they already have to vote, to move amendments, and to be part of the debate, Mr. Speaker, those are sacrosanct. Those are important points to continue, and this amendment shouldn't affect them. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm very glad to see that the member from Fredericton South was engaged in this process. I think that it is good to see that members from all sides of this House, from all parties, are engaged in this. But I am a little disappointed that we didn't get to the nuts and bolts of this. And perhaps it relates to the fact that that member hasn't had a lot of time in this legislature. But I know that as a backbencher, there can be a great deal of frustration, because the reality is the momentum of all these factors I've outlined, the centralization of power in the central authorities, the weight of the civil service, the inability to affect legislation that comes into this legislature. Those are all factors, Mr. Speaker, that make the life of a backbencher very difficult. And I don't wish that on the honourable member, but I'll tell you, it may be his experience in the next 4 years. And that is, if these bills, it's already difficult enough to affect change in this system. It is already difficult enough to move amendments to bills. And as we've seen with our record, Mr. Speaker, that happens not very often. But if we take away that basic power, members like the member from Fredericton South are going to find himself very frustrated, because he's going to see a lot of bills come in here, come in and leave in exactly the same form, with no amendments and no substantive debate and no substantive change. And, Mr. Speaker, the only thing that gave me solace as I sat in the back row of that side of the House.
Thank you.